Piracy is almost always a service problem and not a pricing problem. If a pirate offers a product anywhere in the world, 24/7, purchasable from the convenience of your personal computer, and the legal provider says the product is region locked, will come to your country in 3 months after the US release, and can only be purchased at a brick and mortar store, then the pirate's service is more valuable. This quote from Steam CEO and co-founder Gabe Newell illustrates a pretty clear picture about staggered release dates for games, but I think it also demonstrates exactly what is wrong with the video game industry's stance on game preservation and why they're failing in stark contrast to the pirates who are keeping their legacy alive. Gaming companies have never seemed to be particularly interested in retaining their old catalogs, with many console generations seeing companies wipe the slate clean and offering no options of accessing their legacy content other than simply owning those previous consoles. Obviously, some of this would be much more difficult in early generations, with games being cartridge-based and each console requiring its own proprietary cartridge, slot, and reader as graphics evolved. So it only makes sense that a console like the SNES couldn't play games from its older brother, the NES. Some companies were more keen on preserving their older titles, with many of the Atari systems supporting older cartridges, and Sega manufacturing an add-on to the Genesis that allowed it to play Master System games. Handhelds were understandably a little different and almost always dominated by Nintendo, but Nintendo generally did a pretty good job of making sure that each new console would support the previous console's library of games. As gaming started to shift into the era of 3D graphics, most console manufacturers were ditching the cartridges of old and moving towards putting games on compact disc with the launches of the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn, so once again it made sense that these new consoles wouldn't be able to play older games. Since that generation, home consoles have almost exclusively used disc to distribute physical games, so many expected backwards compatibility to be a much more viable option. It started off strong with the PlayStation 2 supporting virtually all of the PS1's library, but sadly, it's been a very mixed bag of previous console support. Much like their handhelds, Nintendo offered a bit of legacy support, with the Wii playing GameCube games and the Wii U playing Wii games, but it never extended past the previous console's catalog. Other consoles like the PlayStation 3 showed initial compatibility with the PS2 and PS1, but quickly scrapped the PS2 support as the Emotion chip used to run the games proved to be much too costly to continue manufacturing for the system. Consoles after have shown mixed support for older libraries, with the Xbox team making huge strides to allow older titles playable on newer systems, even though it is limited to a list of working titles. Since moving into this new HD era with consoles like the PlayStation 3 and 4 and Microsoft's Xbox 360 and Xbox One, it has brought about yet another hurdle for game preservation. With HD TVs becoming the new normal, consoles that relied on component AV cables would eventually lose support as TVs moved to exclusively HDMI and USB connections, meaning that even if you still had all of your old game systems, you would need to have a separate CRT television to even play them. There are things like HDMI converter boxes and such, but these are not always reliable and don't necessarily preserve the games in their original state. The point here remains, old systems require specific hardware to play them today, and all of these workarounds are coming from dedicated fans rather than the industry itself. So why is the gaming industry so complacent when it comes to preserving their long-lasting legacy? Well, there are a few factors at play here that all culminate into the reasons why not much effort has been made. For one, gaming as a whole is not quite the same as other industries. When a new media format releases for other mediums, it's fairly simple to re-release older content, as it all functions from a pretty linear standpoint. Like when music shifted from CDs to MP3s, the process was as simple as ripping the audio from the original source into a computer. The same roughly applies to movies, but there is a little bit of struggle increasing the resolution from, say, DVD quality to HD and 4K outputs of Blu-rays, as having the original film and CGI renders is imperative to upscaling films. So, because these mediums are consumed in straight lines from start to finish, it makes preserving these artworks to be a much more achievable task. Video games are a whole different beast though, as not only are they interactive and receptive to the actions of the player, but each one has been developed for a specific piece of hardware, making playing it on different hardware very difficult. Now you would think that with each generation of consoles being ideally twice as powerful as the last, that it would be simple to run older games on them, but because of proprietary chips and other hardware found inside these systems, it ends up being a much larger limitation than first perceived. Outside of Microsoft, none of the big gaming companies seem to be particularly interested in using a large amount of resources in both time and money to keep these old works alive. So now fans of classic and retro gaming are faced with a difficult problem and a large uphill battle to solve it. This is where software-based emulation comes into play and why its emergence is so important. Software emulation in the case of this video is when a piece of hardware like a personal computer or a gaming console uses software to mock the operating system and hardware of another console, making that system's library playable on the newer hardware. The first few eras of video game consoles can be emulated with relative ease as the 2D graphics were not overly complicated. However, with the rise of 3D graphics, hardware in these machines became more and more complex, and many started using proprietary chips and other methods to achieve more modern graphics. This of course makes emulating these much more difficult, and even on a computer that can run the most modern games, emulating even PS2 titles can be tricky and results in countless bugs, glitches, and artifacts. Compiled on top of that, the big gaming companies aren't doing anything to help preserve these older titles, so the call to action has only ever been answered by the most diehard of fans. Thanks to the amazing dedicated work of so many people, the legacies of previous generations can still be enjoyed today, even if that comes with a handful of its own caveats. Of course, since these aren't officially licensed by the original copyright owners, it needs to be said that emulation isn't always the most legal method of playing these games. The actual console emulation itself isn't illegal, however, the distribution of the actual game files, known as ROMs, is where the legalities of emulation start to get shady. The only legal ways to obtain ROMs is to only download ones that you physically own, which is its own legal gray area, or buy the proper equipment used to rip the data from your games onto your computer. With the current market for retro games being higher than ever, just look at these charts of Pokemon games over the past couple of years, it's unreasonable to think that anyone would be capable of playing their favorite games without a substantial burden to their finances. It's funny, of course, that the same companies who refuse to make any effort to preserve their catalog of old titles are the same ones issuing takedown notices and lawsuits to the very people doing their best to preserve the legacies they've left behind. Most ROM websites have been taken down by legal teams from the big gaming companies, especially Nintendo, leaving the diehard fans to resort to piracy to even be able to have these retro experiences. Just like the quote from Gabe Newell at the start of the video expresses, when gamers beg and beg for companies to offer some kind of options to experience their favorite retro classics, it's only sensible that they would resort to pirating these games when you offer them no reasonable way of playing them. To these people, ensuring that themselves and future generations can continue to experience the storied history of gaming far outweighs the risk of legal action they could face by doing so. At the end of the day, software engineers and diehard fans will continue to do the amazing work that the publishers refuse to. As long as that keeps happening, gaming giants will continue to wage their war on piracy. But if those with a strong will continue with their emulation efforts, the preservation of the history of video games will still have a glimmer of hope. So yeah, it's safe to say that retro games are in a bit of a weird place right now. With the big companies not really wanting to do much to keep their legacies alive, it's being left to the dedicated fans and, of course, the pirates. But let me know what you guys think. Are you guys interested in retro games, or do you not really care that much? Let me know in the comments below how you feel about all this, and be sure to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Hit that subscribe button and the bell icon if you want to get notified every time I upload. And make sure to check me out on Twitter and Instagram if you want to hear more of my mild gaming takes. And with that, I've been TheNamesJER. Thanks for watching. See you later!
I guess it's my turn. Here we go. Here we go. We're gonna go flying down the days. Build another acres and blow the man down. Here we go. And nobody knows we're all around. Here we go, boys. Another round. I'm just, yeah. Part of the ship, part of the crew.